Sometimes the loneliest chair in the room tells you exactly how cruel a town can be. The Fellowship Hall of Mercy Hill Church glowed warm against the bitter Montana winter night, its frosted windows shining like lanterns across the snow-covered road while laughter drifted out into the cold December air. Inside, nearly every table was crowded shoulder to shoulder with families passing bowls of mashed potatoes, slices of honey ham, warm biscuits dripping with butter, and steaming mugs of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Children chased one another between folding chairs while older women traded recipes near the dessert table lined with pecan pies and peach cobblers. The annual church supper had always been the kind of gathering where nobody was supposed to sit alone. But Clara Whitmore did. Her table sat near the back corner beneath a dim yellow light, far enough from the fire stove that the cold still clung to her hands despite the wool gloves folded neatly beside her plate. 3 empty chairs surrounded her like silent accusations. Nobody had touched them all evening. Nobody planned to. Clara kept her eyes lowered toward the untouched bowl of stew in front of her, pretending not to notice the glances drifting her way every few seconds. She had learned over the past year that humiliation became easier to survive when you acted like you couldn't hear it. But the whispers always found her anyway. "That's her. Poor thing. No, don't stare. I heard her husband left without even saying goodbye. My sister says she brings sorrow wherever she goes." Clara's fingers tightened around her spoon until her knuckles turned pale. She focused on the steam curling from the stew instead of the voices around her. Outside, snow blew hard against the church windows in sharp white bursts. The weather report earlier that morning had warned folks the storm rolling down from the Bitterroot Mountains could dump nearly a foot before sunrise. Most people had arrived early to avoid the roads freezing over. Clara almost hadn't come at all. But loneliness could make a person desperate enough to sit in rooms where nobody wanted them, if only to hear human voices for a while. Across the hall, laughter suddenly rose from one of the larger tables where couples sat pressed close together beneath strings of Christmas garland. Clara looked away quickly before envy could settle too deeply in her chest. Last winter she had sat beside her husband in this same church hall while he joked with neighbors and carved turkey for their table. Back then people had smiled when she walked into a room. Back then nobody whispered. Back then she still believed grief belonged only to other families. A little girl carrying cornbread started toward Clara's table before her mother gently caught her wrist halfway there. The woman leaned down and whispered something into the child's ear. The little girl glanced apologetically toward Clara before allowing herself to be guided back to another table. Clara swallowed hard and stared down at her plate again. The rejection should not have hurt anymore. But somehow it always did. The church doors suddenly creaked open against the wind. A sharp gust of cold air swept through the fellowship hall, carrying snowflakes across the wooden floorboards. Conversations faltered almost instantly. Even the children grew quieter. Clara looked up before she could stop herself. A man stood in the doorway, broad shoulders dusted white with snow, one large gloved hand still gripping the heavy church door behind him. Malcolm Reed looked like winter itself had carved him out of the mountains. Tall, dark-skinned, heavily built beneath a weathered brown coat, he carried the kind of presence that made people instinctively straighten in their seats. Snow melted slowly from the brim of his hat while cold air curled around his boots. Clara had heard the stories about him same as everyone else in town. The mountain man who lived alone nearly 20 miles beyond Black Pine Ridge. The man who trapped wolves in winter and cut cedar by hand. The man who only came into town once or twice a month for supplies. Folks said Malcolm Reed preferred silence to company and trusted animals more than people. Some called him dangerous simply because they did not understand him. Malcolm removed his gloves slowly, scanning the crowded fellowship hall with calm, unreadable eyes. People avoided looking at him too long. Nobody waved him over to their table. Nobody invited him to sit. For one strange suspended moment, Clara realized they were both standing outside the warmth of the room in entirely different ways. Then Malcolm's gaze landed on the empty chairs surrounding her table. And he did not look away. The room stayed unnaturally quiet for several long seconds after Malcolm Reed stepped inside the fellowship hall. Snow drifted through the open doorway behind him before he pushed the heavy church door shut with one broad hand, sealing the warmth back inside the building. Clara lowered her eyes again almost immediately, pretending interest in the cold spoon resting beside her bowl, but she could still feel the shift moving through the room like wind across dry grass. People always reacted when Malcolm appeared. Some out of curiosity. Most out of discomfort. The older women near the dessert table exchanged subtle glances over their coffee cups while a pair of ranchers near the stove suddenly found deep interest in their plates. Nobody greeted him directly. Nobody offered him a seat. Mercy Hill liked to call itself a welcoming church, but Clara had learned that welcome often came with conditions nobody spoke aloud. Malcolm stamped snow from his boots near the entrance before removing his coat slowly, revealing a dark flannel shirt stretched across shoulders hardened by years of mountain labor. The firelight caught faint silver threads near his temples, though he could not have been much older than 40. He carried himself with the calm stillness of a man who spent more time listening to forests than conversations. Clara had seen him only twice before in town. Once hauling cedar planks through the general store during spring thaw. Another time standing alone beside the feed supply while a storm rolled over the valley. Both times people had watched him carefully without ever stepping too close. Malcolm walked toward the serving tables in silence while the whispers quietly resumed around the room. Clara tried not to listen, but isolation sharpened a person's hearing whether they wanted it or not. He should not even be here tonight. Pastor said everybody was invited. That man barely speaks to anybody. Still better company than her. A soft burst of laughter followed. Clara felt heat creep into her cheeks despite the cold still trapped in her fingers. She reached for her water glass just to give her trembling hands something to hold. Across the hall, Malcolm filled a plate with roast chicken, potatoes, cornbread, and green beans without acknowledging anyone around him. The line parted naturally to make room for him, though nobody said a word. Clara noticed he took only black coffee, no pie, no dessert, nothing unnecessary. Practical. Efficient. Like a man who measured life by survival instead of comfort. Near the center tables, Pastor Eugene cleared his throat loudly in an attempt to restore cheerfulness to the room. Terrible weather tonight, he announced with forced brightness. Looks like the Lord plans to keep us all snowed in together a while longer. A few polite chuckles answered him. Clara glanced toward the frosted windows where snow now slammed sideways against the glass under growing winds. The storm had worsened fast. Some of the younger mothers were already whispering about leaving before the roads disappeared completely. But Clara knew she had nowhere urgent to be. The little rented room above Mrs. Hargrove's laundry house would still be cold and empty whether she returned tonight or tomorrow morning. She focused again on her untouched dinner. Around her, chairs scraped, silverware clinked, conversations rose and fell in gentle waves of family warmth she no longer belonged to. It had been nearly 10 months since her husband Thomas packed his suitcase and boarded the early train east after the loss of their baby. He had not shouted. He had not blamed her directly. Somehow that almost hurt worse. He simply could not remain in a house filled with grief anymore, and Mercy Hill had quietly decided Clara carried too much sadness for decent company after that. People stopped visiting. Invitations stopped arriving. Even kindness toward her became careful and brief, as though loneliness itself might spread from person to person like winter sickness. Clara heard footsteps moving across the wooden floorboards then. Slow. Steady. Heavy enough to silence nearby conversations one by one. Her pulse tightened unexpectedly. She kept staring downward until a deep quiet settled directly beside her table. Then came the scrape of a chair being pulled backward across the floor. Not one of the empty chairs beside the fire. Not one near the families laughing together. One directly across from her. Clara looked up before she could stop herself. Malcolm Reed sat down at her table like the rest of the room did not exist. For a moment Clara forgot how to breathe. The fellowship hall had gone so quiet she could hear the wind rattling the church windows and the faint crackling of the fire stove near the center of the room. Malcolm Reed set his plate down carefully across from her, the wooden table creaking softly beneath the weight of his large hands. He did not look around to see who was watching. He did not acknowledge the tension tightening through the room. He simply adjusted the chair once, settled into it, and picked up his fork like sitting beside Clara Whitmore was the most natural thing in the world. Somewhere behind them a woman cleared her throat uncomfortably. Another chair scraped loudly across the floor as somebody shifted position to stare. Clara felt every pair of eyes in Mercy Hill pressing against her skin at once. Her face burned with sudden panic. She lowered her voice immediately. "You do not have to sit here," she whispered. Malcolm glanced up at her then. His eyes were dark and calm beneath the low golden light hanging above their table. Not cold. Not pitying. Just steady. "I know," he answered quietly. Then he cut into his chicken like the conversation was over. Clara stared at him in disbelief. Most people in town either ignored her entirely or spoke to her with the careful politeness reserved for strangers at funerals. Nobody chose her table. Nobody willingly stepped into the uncomfortable silence surrounding her. Yet this man who barely spoke to anybody had crossed an entire room full of empty seats to sit directly across from her without hesitation. The whispers around the fellowship hall grew louder now, though. Everyone tried pretending they were not staring. "What is he doing? Lord help that woman. Malcolm Reed always did enjoy making people uncomfortable." Clara gripped her napkin tighter beneath the table. She wanted to disappear beneath the floorboards. But Malcolm continued eating slowly, completely unaffected by the judgment circling around them. There was something strangely immovable about him. Like a cedar tree standing through winter storms while everything else bent under the wind. Pastor Eugene attempted another cheerful announcement near the dessert table, but even his voice sounded strained now. The social balance of the room had shifted, and everybody knew it. Clara finally forced herself to lift her spoon, though her appetite had vanished nearly an hour ago. The stew had gone lukewarm. She barely swallowed 2 bites before setting the spoon down again. Malcolm noticed. He reached for the cornbread basket between them and pushed it slightly closer to her side of the table. "You should eat while it is warm," he said simply. Clara blinked at him. No flirtation. No awkward sympathy. Just practical concern delivered in the same tone a man might use reminding someone to carry firewood before snow came in. Somehow that made it harder for her chest to stop aching. She looked down at the untouched cornbread. "I am not very hungry." Malcolm took a sip of black coffee before answering. "Cold weather makes people think they are less hungry than they are." Clara almost smiled despite herself. It surprised her enough that she quickly lowered her eyes again. Across the room a young couple stood to leave, bundling their children into coats, while snow battered harder against the windows. The storm outside had deepened into near whiteout conditions now. Pastor Eugene moved toward the entrance, and pulled the door open a few inches before quickly shutting it again against the sharp howl of wind. "Roads are getting rough," he called out. "Anybody heading north should probably wait this one out a while longer." A ripple of uneasy murmuring spread through the hall. Clara watched snow spiral against the dark glass like handfuls of ash thrown through the night. Mercy Hill sat miles from the nearest main road, and winter storms in the mountains had a habit of trapping folks longer than expected. Malcolm glanced briefly toward the windows before removing one glove and reaching into the pocket of his coat. He pulled out a folded pair of thick wool gloves and set them quietly beside Clara's plate. She looked up in confusion. "Your hands are shaking," he said. Clara stared at the gloves. They looked worn but carefully maintained, the dark leather softened by years of use. "I cannot take those." Malcolm broke off another piece of cornbread. "Sure you can." The warmth rising from the stove suddenly felt dangerous against the sting building behind Clara's eyes. It had been so long since anybody noticed something as small as whether her hands were cold that she no longer knew what to do with kindness when it appeared. Around them, Mercy Hill Church continued pretending not to watch while every person in the room watched anyway. Clara kept staring at the wool gloves beside her plate long after Malcolm returned his attention to his dinner. The dark leather looked impossibly warm compared to the thin knitted pair folded in her lap, the fingertips already worn pale from 2 Montana winters she could barely afford to survive. She had spent so many months learning how to accept silence from people that simple kindness now felt almost frightening. Across the fellowship hall, conversation slowly resumed in cautious uneven waves, though every few moments Clara still caught someone glancing toward their table before quickly looking away again. Mercy Hill had become skilled at pretending not to judge while judging all the same. Malcolm seemed entirely untouched by it. He ate slowly, calmly, with the patience of a man who had spent long winters alone in the mountains listening to snow fall through pine trees. Clara noticed he never rushed anything. Not his movements. Not his breathing. Not even the way he held his coffee mug between both hands near the warmth of the stove heat drifting through the hall. Outside, the storm deepened. Wind groaned against the church walls hard enough to rattle the hanging reeds near the entrance. Pastor Eugene crossed toward the windows twice within 10 minutes, concern growing more visible on his tired face each time. A few men discussed road conditions near the coat racks while mothers bundled extra blankets around sleeping children. The warmth inside the fellowship hall had begun taking on that strange temporary feeling storms often created, like the building itself had become a small island floating in endless white darkness. Clara finally reached for the gloves Malcolm had given her. The leather felt soft from years of use, lined inside with thick wool still carrying faint traces of cedar smoke and winter air. She slipped them carefully onto her freezing hands and nearly startled at the immediate warmth settling into her fingers. Malcolm glanced up briefly from his coffee. Better? Clara nodded once. Thank you. He gave a small shrug, almost uncomfortable being thanked for something so simple. Cold hands make storms feel longer. Clara looked down again before he could notice how close she suddenly felt to crying. Nobody had spoken to her gently in so long that even ordinary concern scraped painfully against the loneliness she carried every day. Nearby, a young boy chased a paper napkin across the floor before stumbling near Clara's table. The child froze the moment he realized where he had stopped. His mother quickly appeared behind him looking embarrassed. Eli, come here now. The boy hesitated, clutching the napkin tightly while staring at Malcolm with wide, uncertain eyes. Malcolm reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small carved wooden horse no bigger than his palm. He set it quietly on the edge of the table without saying a word. The little boy's face lit instantly. For me? Malcolm nodded once. Eli looked toward his mother for permission before taking the toy carefully into both hands like treasure. Thank you, sir. Malcolm tipped his head slightly, already returning to his coffee. The mother looked stunned for half a second before hurrying the child away. Clara watched the boy race excitedly toward the other tables showing off the wooden horse while whispers immediately followed behind him. Did Malcolm Reed carve that? I heard he makes toys through the winter. Still strange for a man like him. Clara studied Malcolm more carefully then. His large hands looked rough enough to split logs barehanded, yet somehow those same hands had carved tiny wooden details delicate enough to make a child smile. Something about the contrast unsettled her in a quiet, comforting way. You made that? She asked softly. Malcolm nodded. Keeps my hands busy during storms. Clara almost asked more but stopped herself. People in Mercy Hill rarely spoke about Malcolm Reed for long without eventually lowering their voices. The stories around him always sounded larger than the man himself. Dangerous. Unfriendly. Wild. Yet the man sitting across from her had offered gloves to cold hands and carried tiny carved horses in his coat pocket. Near the entrance, the church doors suddenly shook hard beneath a violent gust of wind. Snow burst through the cracks around the frame. Pastor Eugene exhaled heavily and addressed the room. Folks, I do not think anybody should be driving tonight. Roads are nearly buried already. Uneasy murmurs spread immediately through the hall. Some families began discussing where children could sleep while others checked lantern fuel and blankets. Clara's stomach tightened quietly. She had nowhere here to belong once the church supper officially ended. But for the first time in many months, she also realized she no longer sat entirely alone. The storm swallowed the town completely before the church supper could end. By 9 o'clock the fellowship hall windows were coated in thick white frost, and every time the wind struck the old building it sounded like the mountains themselves were breathing against the walls. Families gathered closer together near the fire stove while Pastor Eugene and 2 ranchers checked the front doors again, fighting hard gusts just to crack them open a few inches. Snow had already drifted nearly halfway up the church steps outside. "Road to Black Pine is gone," one of the ranchers announced grimly after stomping snow from his boots. "Can barely see 10 feet ahead." Uneasy murmurs moved through the room again. Mothers pulled children closer while older couples quietly discussed blankets, lanterns, and where everyone might sleep if the storm lasted until morning. Clara sat still at her table listening to the shifting conversations around her while slowly warming her fingers inside Malcolm's gloves. The leather still carried faint traces of cedar and winter smoke. She could not remember the last time her hands had stopped aching from cold this quickly. Across from her, Malcolm finished his coffee in silence before standing to carry both their empty mugs toward the serving tables. Clara blinked softly in surprise when she realized he had taken hers automatically, as though caring for small burdens had become instinct to him long ago. The room watched him move through the church hall the same way people watched approaching thunder. Careful. Curious. Slightly afraid. But Clara noticed something different now. Nobody stopped him. Nobody mocked him. The same people who whispered behind his back also quietly stepped aside whenever he walked past. Malcolm returned a few minutes later carrying fresh coffee for both of them along with another piece of cornbread wrapped carefully in a napkin. He placed it near Clara's plate without explanation before sitting down again. "You keep forgetting to eat," he said calmly. Clara looked down at the food. "You noticed that?" Malcolm leaned back slightly in his chair. "You have not finished a full meal all night." The simple observation embarrassed her more than it should have. She lowered her eyes toward the table. "I suppose I lost my appetite somewhere this year." Malcolm studied her quietly for a moment, not pushing for details. That alone felt strangely kind. Most people in Mercy Hill either avoided her grief entirely or tried forcing cheerful advice onto wounds they did not understand. Malcolm simply let silence exist without making her feel guilty for carrying sadness inside it. Near the stove, little Eli proudly showed his carved wooden horse to several other children. Within minutes 3 more children cautiously wandered toward Malcolm's table, curiosity overcoming fear. A freckled girl no older than 7 stopped beside Clara first. "Did Mr. Reed really make that horse?" she whispered. Clara glanced toward Malcolm. He gave the smallest nod. The little girl's eyes widened with wonder. "Can you make rabbits too?" Malcolm folded his large hands around the coffee mug. "Sometimes." Another child stepped closer. "My pa says you live all alone in the mountains." Malcolm nodded once again. "Most winters." "Are you lonely?" the boy asked innocently. Half the adults in the room immediately stiffened in embarrassment at the question, but Malcolm only glanced toward the storm outside before answering. "Sometimes people are lonelier in crowded rooms than they are in cabins." Clara felt those words settle quietly inside her chest. The children remained near the table after that, asking about snowshoe trails, pine forests, elk tracks, and mountain storms while Malcolm answered with short, patient responses that somehow kept all of them listening carefully. Clara watched the scene in disbelief. This feared silent man from the mountains spoke to children more gently than most people in Mercy Hill had spoken to her in months. At some point little Ellie Harper climbed onto the empty chair beside Clara holding a cup of cocoa too large for her small hands. Clara instinctively steadied the mug before it spilled. "Thank you," the child whispered shyly. Clara smiled softly before she could stop herself. It felt unfamiliar against her face. Malcolm noticed. He did not comment on it. But something in his expression softened near the edges. Across the room 2 older women watched the interaction with visible disapproval. Clara overheard one whisper sharply, "Now she has the children around her too." The words hit harder than they should have. The fragile warmth inside Clara immediately tightened again. She lowered her eyes toward the table, the old instinct to shrink inward returning before she could fight it. But Malcolm heard the whisper too. He slowly set down his coffee mug. Then, without looking toward the women at all, he reached over and pulled the basket of fresh biscuits closer to Clara's side of the table, like he was quietly reminding the entire room exactly where he intended to sit. By 10 o'clock the church supper no longer felt like a gathering. It felt like a shelter. Blankets appeared from storage closets. Folding tables were pushed against the walls to make space for children to sleep. Pastor Eugene lit extra lanterns when the electricity flickered twice beneath the strain of the storm outside. Snow hammered the church roof in steady, violent waves while wind moaned through the old wooden beams hard enough to make several younger children nervous. Yet somehow the small corner where Clara sat beside Malcolm felt calmer than the rest of the building. Warmth gathered there quietly. Not loud or dramatic. Just steady. Safe. Clara helped stack empty dishes near the serving counter while several women worked around her without speaking directly to her. She had grown used to the careful avoidance by now, though tonight it seemed less powerful somehow. Perhaps because every time she glanced across the fellowship hall, Malcolm Reed remained exactly where he said he would be. Near midnight little Ellie Harper fell asleep curled against Clara's shoulder beneath a wool blanket, while her exhausted mother helped organize bedding near the church office. Clara instinctively adjusted the blanket higher around the child's chin, brushing loose curls gently away from her face. She did not notice Malcolm watching until she looked up and found his eyes already on her. Either of them spoke for several seconds. The fire stove crackled softly nearby while snow hissed against the windows behind them. "You are good with children," Malcolm finally said quietly. Clara swallowed before answering. "I used to help in the nursery before." Her voice faded naturally. She no longer knew how to finish sentences involving the life she lost. Malcolm did not force her to continue. He simply nodded once and handed her a fresh cup of coffee he had warmed near the stove. "Thank you," she whispered again. Malcolm leaned back slightly in his chair, large hands wrapped around his own mug. "You apologize every time somebody is kind to you." Clara stared down into the coffee, watching steam curl upward beneath the lantern light. "I suppose I forgot what kindness feels like." The words escaped before she could stop them. Shame immediately followed. She hated sounding fragile in front of anyone. But Malcolm only looked toward the storm outside. "Mercy Hill forgot too," he said calmly. Clara glanced up at him then, surprised by the quiet certainty in his voice. Most people danced carefully around the town's treatment of her. Malcolm named it plainly without hesitation. Across the hall, two older men attempted to force the church doors open again before quickly slamming them shut against the blizzard outside. One of them shook snow from his coat and announced, "Roads are buried chest deep in some places now. Nobody is leaving before morning." Several worried murmurs followed. Clara's stomach tightened slightly. Mrs. Hargrove would lock the laundry house by midnight as always. Even if the roads cleared tomorrow, Clara doubted anyone would volunteer to drive her back across town. Malcolm seemed to notice the worry crossing her face. "You have somewhere warm to stay once this passes?" Clara hesitated too long. That alone answered the question. Malcolm looked down at his coffee for a moment before speaking again. "The room above the laundry house barely keeps heat in summer." Clara blinked in surprise. "How did you know where I live?" "Town talks." There was no judgment in the words. Only simple fact. Clara gave a faint tired smile despite herself. "Apparently they do little else." Something almost resembling amusement flickered briefly across Malcolm's face before disappearing again. It changed him unexpectedly. Softer around the edges. Less like the dangerous mountain ghost Mercy Hill whispered about and more like an ordinary tired man who had spent too many winters alone. Near the fire stove, little Eli wandered back toward their table clutching the carved wooden horse Malcolm had given him earlier. "Mr. Reed," he whispered carefully, "do mountain cabins get lonely during storms?" Several nearby adults immediately stiffened, embarrassed again by the child's honesty. Malcolm looked toward the snow-covered windows before answering. "Sometimes." Eli considered this seriously. "What do you do then?" Malcolm glanced toward Clara for only half a second before answering the boy. You keep the fire going. Until morning. Something deep inside Clara tightened painfully at those words. Because for the first time in nearly a year, she realized someone had quietly sat beside her in the cold instead of leaving her there alone. The church grew quieter after midnight. One by one the children drifted to sleep beneath borrowed quilts, while lantern light flickered softly across the fellowship hall walls. Snow still buried the windows outside in endless waves of white, but inside Mercy Hill the sharp edge of fear had begun giving way to exhaustion. Families settled into temporary corners with blankets and coats bundled beneath their heads while Pastor Eugene moved carefully between rows checking lantern oil and offering extra firewood for the stove. Clara sat near the warmth of the fire with little Ellie asleep beside her, the child's small hand still wrapped loosely around Clara's sleeve as though afraid she might disappear if she let go. Malcolm remained nearby repairing a loose leg on one of the folding tables with a pocket knife and a strip of leather cord he carried inside his coat. Clara watched him quietly for several minutes. Everything about the man seemed built for storms. Calm hands. Steady movements. No wasted energy. Even now, while most people in the church looked restless or worried, Malcolm carried the same quiet patience he had worn all evening. He noticed her watching eventually but did not make a thing of it. Table was wobbling, he said simply, tightening the leather knot once more. Clara smiled faintly. You fix everything you touch? Malcolm glanced toward the sleeping children near the stove. Only things left out in bad weather too long. The words settled deep in her chest before she could stop them. Clara looked down quickly, pretending to smooth the blanket around Ellie instead. She hated how easily this man's quiet kindness slipped past defenses she had spent months building. Across the room, several women whispered together while organizing bedding near the church kitchen. Clara caught fragments drifting toward her through the low crackling firelight. People will talk. He barely knows her. Still, it does not look proper. Clara's shoulders tightened automatically. Shame had become almost instinctive now. Even moments of comfort carried the expectation they would eventually be taken away. Before she could retreat inward completely, Malcolm stood from his chair and walked toward the stove without saying a word. He returned a moment later carrying another folded blanket. Instead of handing it directly to Clara, he draped it carefully over the sleeping children nearby first, then set the remaining edge across Clara's shoulders like it belonged there naturally. No hesitation. No embarrassment. Just warmth offered quietly in the middle of winter. Clara looked up at him in surprise. You will freeze if you keep giving your blankets away, she whispered. Malcolm pulled his chair slightly closer to the stove before sitting down again. Cabin life teaches a man how to survive cold. The firelight softened the sharp planes of his face for a moment, casting warm gold across skin weathered by mountain wind and years of hard winters. Clara realized then how tired he looked beneath all that steadiness. Not weak. Just worn in the way lonely people often became after carrying silence too long by themselves. Little Eli suddenly wandered over again, clutching his carved horse, his pajama sleeves dragging nearly over his fingertips. Mr. Reed? Malcolm looked up immediately. Yes, sir? The boy pointed toward the snow-covered windows. Are wolves out there tonight? A few nearby adults smiled nervously at the question. Malcolm leaned back slightly in his chair. Probably. Eli's eyes widened. What do they do during storms? Malcolm glanced toward the stove fire before answering. Same thing people do. Stay close to warmth. Stay close to their own. The boy seemed satisfied by that answer, and curled beneath a blanket beside his younger sister moments later. Clara remained very still after hearing those words. Stay close to their own. Such a simple thing. Yet she could not remember the last time she felt like she belonged to anyone at all. Not since Thomas left. Not since Mercy Hill decided grief made her uncomfortable company. The storm outside roared harder suddenly, rattling the windows so violently several children stirred in their sleep. Without thinking, Clara flinched slightly at the sound. Malcolm noticed immediately. He rose from his chair, crossed toward the nearest window, and checked the old latch to make certain it held against the wind. Then he added another log to the stove before returning quietly to his seat. Small actions. Silent actions. Yet every movement carried the same message all evening long. You are safe here. Clara wrapped the blanket tighter around herself while warmth from the fire slowly eased the ache in her chest. For the first time in nearly a year, the loneliness surrounding her no longer felt endless. And somewhere between the storm outside and the quiet man sitting beside the fire, Clara Whitmore realized she had stopped counting the empty chairs around her. Somewhere around 2 in the morning the storm finally began to quiet, though the world outside Mercy Hill Church remained buried beneath thick snow and darkness. Inside the fellowship hall most of the children slept soundly beneath quilts and winter coats spread across the floor. Lanterns burned lower now, casting soft amber light over sleeping families and rows of empty casserole dishes abandoned near the kitchen counter. The sharp tension from earlier in the evening had faded into something slower and quieter. Survival had a way of softening people, even if only for one night. Clara sat near the stove feeding small pieces of cedar into the fire, while Malcolm repaired a broken lantern latch beside her using a tiny screwdriver from his coat pocket. The warmth around them felt strangely domestic now, like they had fallen into some quiet rhythm neither of them had expected. Clara noticed Malcolm rarely stayed still for long. If something needed carrying, fixing, stacking, or tending, he handled it automatically without drawing attention to himself. No complaints. No need for praise. Just steady work. Pastor Eugene approached them carrying 2 extra mugs of coffee. He looked exhausted but relieved the church roof had survived the worst of the storm. Roads will still be dangerous by sunrise, he said quietly. But at least the wind is dying down. Malcolm accepted one mug with a nod. Clara reached for the second carefully, still wrapped in the blanket he had draped over her shoulders hours earlier. Pastor Eugene hesitated briefly before speaking again. Miss Whitmore, some of the women are setting up a resting area in the Sunday school room if you would rather sleep there. Clara immediately understood what he truly meant. Separate from Malcolm. Separate from the whispers already spreading through the church hall. Before she could answer, Malcolm calmly tightened the lantern latch and handed the repaired piece back to Pastor Eugene. She is fine here. The pastor looked slightly uncomfortable but finally nodded and walked away without argument. Clara stared down into her coffee for several seconds after he left. You did not have to do that, she whispered softly. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the fire. Yes, I did. The simple certainty in his voice sent warmth through her chest stronger than the stove beside them. Across the room, little Ellie woke briefly and wandered sleepily toward Clara carrying a blanket half dragging behind her. Without hesitation the child climbed directly into the chair beside Clara and curled against her side. Clara instinctively wrapped the blanket around both of them while brushing tangled curls away from the little girl's forehead. Ellie yawned heavily. Mama says storms sound less scary when people stay close together. Clara smiled softly. Your mama sounds smart. Ellie pointed toward Malcolm with sleepy seriousness. Mr. Reed scares grown-ups more than storms do. Clara nearly laughed before quickly covering it with a cough. Malcolm only raised one eyebrow slightly over the rim of his coffee mug. Do I? Ellie nodded confidently. But not kids. The child promptly fell asleep again against Clara's shoulder before anyone could answer. Malcolm watched the sleeping girl for a long, quiet moment. Then his gaze shifted toward Clara. Firelight reflected softly in his dark eyes while snow continued drifting gently beyond the frosted windows. Children usually know who is safe before adults do, he said. Clara felt emotion tighten unexpectedly in her throat. Because somewhere during this long winter night, children had stopped avoiding her too. They sat beside her, fell asleep near her, handed her cocoa cups and asked her questions without fear or judgment. For the first time since losing her baby, Clara no longer felt treated like sorrow itself. Near the kitchen area 2 older women still whispered occasionally while folding blankets, but even their voices had lost some sharpness now. One of them glanced toward Clara holding the sleeping child and quietly looked away instead of glaring. Malcolm rose from his chair then and crossed toward the stove again. He added another log carefully before checking the church doors against the remaining wind outside. Clara watched his broad figure moving through the warm lantern light, while the fellowship hall slept around them. Everything about him felt dependable in a way she had forgotten people could be. Not charming. Not polished. Simply steady. Malcolm returned carrying a second folded blanket which he placed gently over Ellie's feet before sitting beside the fire again. Clara looked at him across the warm, quiet space between their chairs. "You take care of everyone," she said softly. Malcolm stared into the flames for several seconds before answering. "Not everyone." His eyes finally lifted toward hers then. "Calm. Certain. Present. Just people left alone in the cold." The fellowship hall settled into deep quiet sometime after 3 in the morning. The storm outside had softened into slow drifting snow, but the roads remained buried beneath thick white banks stretching across the valley. Inside Mercy Hill Church the lanterns burned low and golden, while the stove filled the room with steady warmth and the scent of cedar smoke. Sleeping children lay bundled beneath quilts beside their parents, while soft breathing and the occasional crackle of fire replaced the tension that had filled the room earlier that evening. Clara had not slept. She sat near the stove with Ellie still curled against her shoulder, while Malcolm rested quietly in the chair across from them, one boot stretched toward the fire, broad arms folded loosely across his chest. He did not truly seem asleep either. Men who spent winters alone in the mountains probably learned to rest lightly. Clara studied him carefully in the dim firelight, while the church slept around them. Everything about Malcolm Reed contradicted the stories people told. Mercy Hill described him like some hard, dangerous creature living beyond civilization. Yet all night he had done nothing except keep children warm, repair broken things, carry firewood, and notice when someone's hands were cold. Clara lowered her eyes quickly before he could catch her staring again. But his voice came quietly through the firelight anyway. "You should try sleeping a while." Clara looked up, startled. Malcolm had not opened his eyes yet. "I thought you were asleep." One corner of his mouth moved slightly. "Storm cabins teach a man to listen even when his eyes are closed." Clara smiled faintly despite herself. The sound of wind brushing gently against the church walls no longer frightened her now. Somehow the room felt anchored while Malcolm sat there beside the stove. She carefully adjusted the blanket around Ellie before speaking again. "Can I ask you something?" Malcolm opened his eyes then and looked toward her calmly. "You can ask." Clara hesitated. "Why did you sit at my table tonight?" The question lingered quietly between them. Malcolm looked toward the sleeping family scattered across the fellowship hall before answering. "Because nobody else did." Clara swallowed hard. Such a simple answer should not have unraveled her chest the way it did. She stared down at the child sleeping against her shoulder, fighting suddenly against tears she had spent nearly a year holding back. Malcolm seemed to notice immediately. He leaned forward slowly and placed another piece of cedar into the stove without drawing attention to her struggle, giving her space instead of watching. Somehow that gentleness made it worse. Clara's voice finally broke anyway. "I used to think if I stayed quiet long enough people would stop looking at me like something terrible happened because of me." Malcolm remained silent, letting her continue in her own time. The warmth of the fire flickered softly across the fellowship hall walls while snow drifted peacefully outside the windows now. Clara stared into the flames as she spoke. "After we lost the baby, Thomas changed. At first everybody brought casseroles and flowers and scripture verses. Then after a few months people stopped visiting. Then Thomas stopped talking much at all." Her hands tightened around the blanket. "One morning he packed a suitcase and said he could not breathe inside our house anymore." Malcolm listened without interruption. No pity. No false comfort. Just steady attention. Clara swallowed again before forcing herself onward. "After he left, the town decided grief must be catching somehow. Women stopped sitting beside me at church. Invitations disappeared. People looked at me like I carried failure around in my coat pockets." Her voice lowered to almost nothing. "Eventually I stopped trying to sit with anyone. The confession hung heavily in the quiet room. Clara expected sympathy, or awkward silence, or careful church words about healing. Instead, Malcolm stared into the fire for several long seconds before speaking in that same calm, steady voice. They failed you. Clara looked up sharply. The certainty in his tone nearly stole the breath from her lungs. Malcolm finally met her eyes fully then. Losing people makes other folks uncomfortable. Easier for them to step away than sit beside pain they cannot fix. Clara felt tears slide silently down her cheeks before she could stop them. She quickly looked down, embarrassed. But Malcolm only reached toward the small table beside the stove and quietly slid a folded handkerchief closer to her side without a word. No staring. No questions. Just simple care offered gently in the middle of the night. Clara pressed the cloth to her eyes while the church remained asleep around them. Somewhere beyond the frosted windows dawn still waited hours away. But for the first time since Thomas left, Clara no longer felt invisible inside her own grief. Because a quiet mountain man had looked directly at her loneliness and sat down beside it instead of walking away. Dawn arrived slowly over Mercy Hill Church, pale winter light filtering through frost-covered windows while the storm finally loosened its grip on the valley. The Fellowship Hall stirred awake little by little beneath the soft crackle of the stove and the rustling of blankets across the floor. Children yawned sleepily while exhausted parents stretched stiff backs and checked the snow outside through narrow openings in the curtains. Clara blinked awake near the fire, disoriented for a moment by the warmth surrounding her. Ellie still slept curled against her side beneath two thick blankets, while the scent of fresh coffee drifted quietly through the room. For one peaceful second Clara forgot the loneliness waiting beyond these church walls. Then memory returned gently instead of painfully this time. Malcolm. She looked up automatically and found him near the stove pouring coffee into tin mugs while Pastor Eugene spoke quietly beside him. The mountain man had already been awake long enough to bring in extra firewood from the covered storage shed outside despite snow still reaching nearly to his knees. Frost clung faintly to the shoulders of his coat, melting slowly near the warmth of the stove. Clara watched him hand steaming mugs to tired parents before checking the church doors once again against the remaining wind outside. He moved through the room with the same steady quiet care he had shown all night. No attention drawn to himself. No expectation of thanks. Just simple dependable presence. Ellie stirred sleepily beside Clara and rubbed her eyes. Did the storm stop? Clara smiled softly while tucking the blanket around the little girl's shoulders. I think it finally got tired. The child giggled quietly before spotting Malcolm across the room. Mr. Reed already fixed the stove pipe this morning. Clara blinked in surprise. The stove pipe? Ellie nodded enthusiastically. It was making funny noises. He climbed up outside before the sun came up. Clara glanced toward Malcolm again, imagining him standing alone in deep snow before sunrise just to keep the church warm for everyone else inside. Something about the image tightened her chest painfully in the gentlest way. Pastor Eugene soon addressed the room once most folks had awakened. Roads into town are still rough, but a few men are clearing paths now. We should be able to leave carefully by midday if the weather holds. Relief moved through the fellowship hall immediately. Families began gathering blankets and packing sleeping children into coats while conversations slowly returned to normal. Yet Clara felt something entirely different settle over her instead. Dread. Because daylight meant this strange, fragile shelter around her would disappear soon. Mercy Hill would return to being Mercy Hill. People would go back to their usual tables, their usual lives, their usual distance from her. She quietly folded the blankets near the stove while trying not to let the heaviness show on her face. Malcolm appeared beside her carrying another armful of firewood before setting it carefully near the hearth. You slept some, he observed. Clara nodded faintly. More than I expected. Malcolm studied her for a brief moment, his dark eyes calm beneath the pale morning light. Good. Across the fellowship hall 2 women whispered together while watching them again. Clara caught only pieces. People are already talking. A whole night sitting together. Poor judgment all around. The warmth inside Clara immediately tightened. Old shame returned so quickly it almost stole her breath. She stepped back automatically, lowering her eyes toward the folded blankets in her hands. Malcolm heard the whispers too. She knew he did because his shoulders went still for one short second. Then he calmly crossed the room toward the coffee table without acknowledging the women at all. Clara hated herself a little for feeling relieved when he did not respond. She did not want trouble following him because of her. Yet moments later Malcolm returned carrying a fresh mug of coffee and a warm biscuit wrapped neatly in a cloth napkin. He placed both directly into Clara's hands in full view of the entire room. "You barely ate yesterday," he said simply. The fellowship hall fell quieter again around them. Clara looked up at him, startled by the deliberate public gentleness of the gesture. Malcolm remained completely calm beneath the stares surrounding them. Like the opinions of the room weighed less to him than whether she had eaten breakfast. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. "You really do not care what people say, do you?" Malcolm glanced toward the frosted windows where sunlight now reflected softly across endless snow outside. "Storms teach you something important," he said quietly. Clara waited. Malcolm finally looked back at her then. "You find out real quick whose warmth keeps you alive and whose opinion never mattered to begin with." By late morning the fellowship hall had transformed back into something closer to ordinary life. Children chased one another between folding chairs while parents packed blankets and empty casserole dishes into wagons and trucks waiting outside beneath bright snow-covered skies. The storm had passed, leaving Mercy Hill wrapped in thick white silence broken only by the crunch of boots across fresh drifts and the distant scrape of men clearing roads through town. Yet beneath the normal sounds returning to the church, Clara could still feel the lingering tension every time certain people glanced toward her and Malcolm. Nothing cruel enough to name directly. Just long looks. Quiet whispers. Careful judgment disguised as concern. Clara stood near the serving counter helping wash coffee mugs while several women worked around her in stiff silence. The warmth she had felt through the night was beginning to slip away beneath the weight of familiar loneliness returning with daylight. She should have expected it. One snowstorm could not change Mercy Hill. People always returned to old habits once comfort came back. A sharp voice finally broke the quiet beside the sink. "You seem awfully comfortable around Mr. Reed all of a sudden." Clara looked up slowly. Mrs. Davenport stood near the drying rack holding a stack of plates against her chest, her expression carefully polite in the way only judgmental people managed. "We were all trapped here together," Clara answered softly. Mrs. Davenport gave a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "Of course. Still, people notice things." The old shame immediately pressed against Clara's ribs again. "There is nothing to notice." Another woman nearby lowered her voice just enough to pretend Clara could not hear. "A whole night sitting together. In front of the children." Mrs. Davenport sighed dramatically. "Mercy Hill has standards to protect." Clara stared down at the coffee mug trembling faintly in her hands. She had heard versions of this conversation for months now. Quiet reminders that grief had somehow made her improper. Too sad. Too damaged. Too visible in the wrong ways. Before she could force herself to respond, a deep calm voice spoke from behind them. Standards should include kindness too. The entire kitchen area fell silent instantly. Malcolm stood in the doorway carrying another crate of firewood from outside, snow still melting from the shoulders of his coat. He looked directly at Mrs. Davenport without anger or raised voice. Somehow that made the silence even heavier. Mrs. Davenport stiffened immediately beneath his gaze. "Mr. Reed, I did not realize you were standing there." Malcolm set the firewood crate down carefully near the stove. Clearly. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Clara could feel her pulse hammering painfully in her chest while Malcolm crossed the room with slow, steady steps. He picked up the trembling coffee mug from her hands before it slipped and quietly set it on the counter beside the sink. Then he handed her a dry kitchen towel like the room had not just turned completely still around them. "You should sit down a while," he said calmly. Mrs. Davenport looked scandalized. "Really, Mr. Reed, This town is only trying to help Miss Whitmore preserve what reputation she has left. Clara felt the words hit like cold water. What reputation she has left. Malcolm went very still then. Not angry. Not loud. Just completely still in a way that suddenly made the entire room uncomfortable. He looked toward Mrs. Davenport with calm dark eyes that never once wavered. A woman loses her husband and child, he said quietly. And your concern is her reputation? Nobody answered him. The kitchen seemed to shrink beneath the weight of his words. Clara stared at Malcolm in shock. Nobody had defended her openly since Thomas left. Nobody had ever challenged Mercy Hill for how they treated her. People preferred avoiding discomfort rather than confronting cruelty hiding inside politeness. But Malcolm Reed stood there holding a kitchen towel in one hand and looked at the women around Clara like he could not understand how they had failed something so simple. Mrs. Davenport finally gathered herself enough to speak again, though less confidently now. You do not understand how this town works. Malcolm glanced toward Clara briefly before answering. Seems to me I understand exactly fine. The silence afterward stretched long enough for the women nearby to slowly lower their eyes and return awkwardly to washing dishes. No apology came. But neither did another whisper. Malcolm turned toward Clara again, his expression softening immediately around the edges. Come on, he said quietly. You have been standing too long. Clara followed him toward the stove area in stunned silence while warmth spread painfully through her chest. Not because Malcolm had embarrassed anyone, but because for the first time in nearly a year, someone had looked directly at her shame and refused to let other people place it on her shoulders. The church parking lot glittered beneath fresh snow by early afternoon, bright winter sunlight reflecting across drifts piled nearly 3 feet high along the road. Men worked together clearing wagon paths while children laughed and tossed handfuls of powder near the church steps now that the storm had finally passed. From a distance Mercy Hill almost looked peaceful again. Ordinary. But inside the fellowship hall, tension still lingered quietly beneath every conversation whenever Clara or Malcolm crossed the room. Clara helped fold the last of the blankets near the stove while families slowly prepared to leave. She moved carefully, trying not to draw attention to herself anymore after the confrontation in the kitchen. Yet she could still feel certain eyes following her. Judging. Measuring. Waiting for her to step outside the fragile line of behavior Mercy Hill demanded from wounded women. Malcolm stood near the entrance speaking briefly with Pastor Eugene about road conditions farther north toward Black Pine Ridge. Snow still covered most of the valley roads, but wagons could finally pass through town again with caution. Clara knew what came next. People would leave. Malcolm would disappear back into the mountains. And she would return to the cold room above the laundry house where nobody knocked on the door unless rent was due. The thought settled heavily in her chest. Little Ellie suddenly wrapped both arms around Clara's waist from behind. Do you have to go? The child asked sadly. Clara smiled softly while smoothing the girl's curls. Everybody has to go home eventually. Ellie frowned seriously. You looked happier here. The innocent honesty nearly broke Clara's heart. Before she could answer, Ellie's mother approached looking embarrassed again. Ellie, do not bother Miss Whitmore. But the woman's voice carried less coldness than before. She hesitated awkwardly before adding, Thank you for helping with the children last night. Clara blinked softly in surprise. Of course. The woman nodded once and gently guided Ellie away, though the little girl continued waving toward Clara until she disappeared outside. Small things. Tiny changes. Yet Clara felt them all the same. Across the room Mrs. Davenport stood near the church doors speaking quietly with 2 other women while occasionally glancing toward Malcolm. Their expressions tightened the moment he walked closer carrying another stack of folded chairs towards storage. One of the women finally spoke loud enough for Clara to hear. Some people seem very eager to forget proper boundaries after one snowstorm. Clara immediately lowered her eyes, shame returning like reflex. But before she could retreat into silence again, Malcolm calmly set the chairs down beside the wall and turned toward the women. The entire fellowship hall seemed to quiet instinctively when he spoke. You still talking about boundaries? His voice remained low and steady. No anger. Somehow that only sharpened every word. Mrs. Davenport crossed her arms tightly. This town protects its values, Mr. Reed. Malcolm glanced briefly toward Clara standing beside the stove before looking back at the women. Funny thing about values, he said calmly. You can usually tell what people truly value by who they leave sitting alone. The words landed heavily across the room. Nobody answered. Pastor Eugene stopped sorting hymn books near the stage. Several ranchers near the entrance suddenly found deep interest in their boots. Even the children grew quieter. Malcolm stepped closer to the stove area then, stopping beside Clara without hesitation. The movement itself felt deliberate. Public. Clear. Mrs. Davenport's expression hardened. You hardly know this woman. Clara felt her stomach tighten painfully. But Malcolm answered before she could shrink beneath the words again. I know enough. The woman gave a disapproving shake of her head. Mercy Hill does not need more gossip. Malcolm looked directly at her. Then maybe Mercy Hill should spend less time creating it. Silence flooded the room completely after that. Not hostile silence. The heavier kind. The kind that arrived when truth finally sat down where everybody could see it. Clara stared at Malcolm in disbelief, while warmth spread painfully through her chest again. Nobody had ever chosen her publicly before. Not since grief changed the shape of her life. Most kindness toward her came hidden behind closed doors or whispered carefully when nobody else might judge. But Malcolm Reed stood beside her in front of the entire church without even a trace of hesitation. Like sitting beside Clara Whitmore required no apology at all. A few moments later Pastor Eugene quietly cleared his throat and announced wagon departures outside. The room slowly began moving again, conversations returning in awkward uneven waves. Malcolm reached for Clara's coat hanging near the stove and held it open for her without ceremony. She slipped her arms into it slowly while snow-bright sunlight spilled through the church windows around them. Then Malcolm adjusted the scarf near her collar once against the cold draft by the door before speaking quietly enough that only she could hear. You do not have to keep standing where people make you feel unwanted. Clara looked up at him, breath catching softly in her chest. And for the first time since Thomas left, the idea of belonging somewhere no longer felt impossible. The road outside Mercy Hill Church glittered beneath fresh snow as wagons and trucks slowly disappeared. Down the mountain path one by one. The storm had left the valley transformed into a world of white cedar trees, frozen fences, and smoke curling gently from distant chimneys beneath the pale winter sky. Clara stood near the church steps clutching her coat tightly against the cold, while the last families prepared to leave. Children waved goodbye from wagon beds piled high with blankets, while boots crunched steadily across packed snow. The fellowship hall behind her had almost emptied now. The warmth, the firelight, the strange shelter of the past night already felt fragile enough to vanish like breath in cold air. Clara watched Mrs. Davenport climb into a wagon without looking at her once. Pastor Eugene offered polite farewells to everyone gathered outside, though even he seemed quieter than usual after everything that had happened. Mercy Hill would continue on exactly as it always had. People would whisper. Tables would fill. Chairs beside Clara would probably remain empty again. The old ache returned slowly inside her chest. Malcolm emerged from the church carrying the final crate of lanterns from the fellowship hall storage room. Snow crunched beneath his heavy boots as he crossed toward the wagon path, setting the crate carefully beside Pastor Eugene's truck before checking the harness straps on a nearby team of horses. Even outside in the bitter cold he moved with the same calm steadiness that had carried her through the storm. Clara realized suddenly that she did not want him to leave. The thought startled her with its honesty. She lowered her eyes quickly toward the snow-covered ground. After Thomas left, she had stopped allowing herself to need anyone. Need only led to abandonment. That lesson had settled deep into her bones. Yet now the idea of returning alone to the tiny rented room above the laundry house felt colder than the Montana winters surrounding her. Little Ellie suddenly ran back across the churchyard, boots slipping slightly in the snow before she wrapped her arms tightly around Clara's waist again. You are coming next Sunday, right? Clara smiled softly despite the ache building in her throat. Maybe. Ellie frowned. You should sit with Mr. Reed again. The child's mother hurried over looking embarrassed, but Clara only knelt slightly to straighten the little girl's scarf. You be good for your mama, she whispered. Ellie nodded seriously before pointing toward Malcolm standing near the wagons. He smiles more when you are around. Clara looked up instinctively. Malcolm stood several yards away speaking quietly with Pastor Eugene, broad shoulders framed against endless white snow and pine-covered hills. As though sensing her gaze, he glanced toward her too. Their eyes met across the churchyard for one long still moment. Then Pastor Eugene climbed into his truck and the final wagon rolled slowly away, leaving only silence behind. Within minutes the church parking lot stood nearly empty beneath the pale winter sun. Clara wrapped her coat tighter and prepared herself to walk back into town alone. But Malcolm crossed the snow toward her before she could take more than 2 steps. He stopped close enough for her to see melting snowflakes caught against the dark wool collar of his coat. Neither of them spoke immediately. The cold air drifted quietly between them while wind stirred loose powder across the church steps. Finally Clara managed softly, "Thank you, for all of this." Malcolm studied her face for several seconds with that same calm, unreadable expression he always carried. You heading back to the laundry house? Clara nodded once. Malcolm looked toward the distant road winding through town. He barely works there. Clara gave a faint, tired smile. You really do know everything about Mercy Hill. Enough. Silence settled again. Clara prepared herself for goodbye. For the end of whatever impossible kindness this storm had briefly created between them. Instead, Malcolm reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a pair of keys attached to a worn leather strap. He held them loosely in one hand while snow drifted quietly around them. Road to my cabin is clear enough now, he said calmly. Clara blinked in confusion. Malcolm glanced toward the mountains beyond town where dark pines stretched beneath bright snow-covered ridges. There is extra firewood, plenty of coffee, and nobody there cares where you sit during supper. Clara felt her breath catch painfully in her chest. Malcolm's voice remained low and steady beneath the winter wind. You do not have to decide anything today. He placed the keys gently into her gloved hands anyway. The metal felt warm from his pocket despite the cold surrounding them. Clara stared down at the keys for several silent seconds before finally looking back up at him. Malcolm shifted slightly beside her, his dark eyes calm beneath the pale winter sunlight. But if you are tired of eating alone, he said quietly, there is a second chair waiting at my table. And for the first time since grief hollowed out her life, Clara Whitmore stood in the middle of the snow and realized someone had finally made room for her to stay.